Today, I have the privilege to share with you the essence of very complex architecture that I've been working on for about 7 years. 7 years now, I think. Compiling this presentation in a manner that's easy to understand was probably the most challenging task I've had. The concepts that you will have learned after this presentation have been applied in a number of organizations and their respective markets, as Josh said, and I want you to introduce you to it. So our goal for today is to talk about super apps, why they are valuable, how you can essentially adopt a super app architecture if you are used to monolithic systems. I'll show you how you can decouple your monolith into features and then reintegrate them into an app core. You'll also learn about some of the pitfalls, especially with maintenance, as we talk about feature orchestration. Since this architecture is very interesting to products that deal with multi-tenancy, I'll also show you how you can, claim the high ground with super apps. Development experience will really make or break the system. So this is why I would love to share a few useful tips about that too. And then I think the most important part of the session today is your participation. You can also get a giveaway. You can ask questions throughout the presentation in the Q&A section of Zoom, but I'll make sure we address your questions during the dedicated Q&A time at the end of the presentation. Once again, thank you for taking your valuable time to hear me out today. My name is Gregor. That's the easiest way to pronounce my name. And I'm Director Engineer at MODUS. As I said earlier, I've been working with some notable enterprises on evolving this super apps architecture for a few years, 7 years. You might have used some of the products that I contributed to, especially if you drive a German car or if you ever bought fast food from a kiosk or online, or bought clothes online, did business with a major bank. You get it. It can't really tell you all the brains, but if there is anything in common with these use cases, it's scalability. And scalability is going to be our keyword for today. In essence, you will learn how to go from being a one-man band to Philharmonic orchestra. Being a part of an orchestra means creating something that's greater than life, greater than oneself. It's not about, one instrument or a tune. It's about symphony. Don't get me wrong if you think I'm saying that there's something wrong with being a one-man band. That's valuable too. It's just a different ballgame. So if there's one thing I hope you get out of this whole summit, is for you to be closer to understanding of what level of scaling makes sense to you and your organization. Either way, I reckon that when you get back to your peers with new skills from today, you'll be their rock star. All right. In a recent study, Gartner estimated that in 4 years' time, more than half of the world's population will use super apps daily. So I guess, we just need to convert Google and Facebook to super apps, and that's a simple way to fulfill that expectation. However, what you should read between those lines is that super apps are great for highly scalable apps, right? What I gather from this research is that 50%, at least 50% of the largest systems in the world are likely to migrate to super apps. As a matter of fact, majority of consumers are welcoming such a transition. And that's because the habits of the Generation Y or the millennials are a great driver for that change. They don't want to wait or visit multiple places to get things done. Just go to one place. And this whole super apps trend may seem kind of a sudden, but it's really not that surprisingly sudden. It has definitely become a more popular catchphrase as of recently. And you'll remember probably more specifically, shortly before buying Twitter, Elon Musk said that he wanted Twitter to be the everything app. And it's not surprising that he wanted to achieve a similar effect that WeChat has in China. As Musk said, you basically live on WeChat in China. So rest aware that 72% of the population of China are active WeChat users. And they can do amazing things from just a single app. They can network, obviously, they can book a flight, send money, haul a cab, and do much more. And for most of us, achieving that level, that grand success of Twitter and WeChat is a moonshot, but that doesn't mean we can't learn from them. And it's about time that we descended back to Kansas and see what super apps can do for the rest of us. Some people compare super apps to a Swiss Army knife, and that really makes a lot of sense. In super apps, you have a core, and that core has to be light. But again, it has to be versatile enough to support all the add-ons. The core then integrates micro apps on demand. And I really like to not use micro apps. I prefer using feature apps. That's because these small apps are focused around delivering a single business value. So it's a knife. It's a corkscrew, right? A feature. It's like do one thing at a time and do it well. With that in mind, super apps enforce many good business practices. They make a play on our habits. We are in a very familiar environment. I'm thinking mentally, right? Where we as users feel safe. We are 1 or 2 clicks away from anything we want. Businesses can easily create drivers for habits that they want us to introduce, to enforce, or even to reduce, But think of it this way. When you go to a conventional restaurant, they seat you, they give you the menu, and then you choose, order, wait, get your food, finally, you eat, right? You usually try a couple of different options in a single visit. The waiter will try to get you to take the dessert, but that is going to induce more waiting because you have to take an order, you have to wait. The point is that the time and all the interactions that are required between your desire and that first bite is long. And there is a different kind of restaurant. There is a London-based franchise that does things differently. You might have heard of Yo Sushi. At Yo Sushi, you sit next to a conveyor belt where food passes you by in little containers. These containers are color-coded based on complexity of food and price, obviously. So Yo Sushi gets to arouse your senses with wonderfully looking food, and they let you just take it. No ordering, no waiting. The desire to order time is brought down from dozens of minutes to just a few seconds. And this is, I think, ingenious play on the psychology of Homo sapiens. Try to make me want something and then let me have it with no hassle. Come to think of it, if Amazon built a giant conveyor belt around the town and let us purchase goods in a manner as simple as taking the packaging off the belt, I think that would be the end game. Superapps helps us achieve that Yo Sushi effect by reducing delays to conversion. Users don't need to switch between apps and platforms. No need to log into multiple places, maintain multiple profiles, right? They can even remove the learning curve to getting things done. We don't have to look at super apps like a giant conspiracy theory. That's entirely not what I'm saying. They are not even a technical framework. Super apps are just an organizational pattern that is well suited for simplifying daily routines. Just make things reachable, easy, fast, reusable. So I just said the main keyword that I want you to remember. Super apps are indeed an organizational pattern. They help businesses organize teams, organize delivery. They ensure, super apps ensure that teams are not just some engineering experts, but also experts at that business value that their feature is all about. They are responsible end-to-end for that feature. And companies that decided to migrate to super apps share some of the just common problems in my experience that triggered the migration. Usually, they have a hard time iterating quickly. In other words, hard time being agile, but no one will ever admit not being agile. In some cases, these organizations are desperately afraid of negative feedback. And I'm specifically talking about negative feedback from the existing users as their major increments are being rolled out, right? Like a brand new theming. Another common thread is cross-team efficiency. When multiple teams don't really coordinate well, I'm sure you've seen that. That can be a nightmare for efficiency. Everybody is really unhappy with that one. Then scaling, that's a huge thing, right? Not just scaling, I don't mean just scaling the product, also scaling the teams, scaling overall. Companies that have presence in many global markets understand how difficult and expensive it can get to maintain each market independently. One company I worked with measured onboarding time for new team members. On average, it took 2 months for a new developer to be able to work independently. 2 months. With some of the good practices that we are discussing today, those 2 months became just 2 days. And I think that's good. That's a good number. I actually know that it probably sounds too good to be true, but it's really simple. It's just that us humans like to overcomplicate things, and we really need to stay away from that. All right, I think it's time to get our hands dirty with super apps. We'll start with a role-playing game. This is Netflix. We know that Netflix makes good use of microfrontends, but I personally don't know exactly how they orchestrate those microfrontends. That's cool. That's all right, because not knowing allows me to think outside the box. So when we look at Netflix UI, it seems incredibly compatible with the super apps architecture that we are talking about today. So if Netflix was a super app, then they would obviously have a core, right? You remember that Swiss Army knife example and its core. App cores are usually UI agnostic. They don't have much UI or any UI, and they wouldn't bake in any specific features. So just looking at these screenshots, I think we can easily identify a few feature app candidates, and you're probably doing that already, but I'll help you out. I think the movie browser, right? That's an interesting feature app. Movie player is a feature as well. Then each of these games that you probably see on the screen, that can be a feature app each on its own. User management, my list, search, fast laughs, the coming soon section, all those can be separate feature apps. So imagine each of these features being owned by a team. They work entirely independently, focused on their own business and whatever key metrics. Their drivers own the release cycles. They own everything about their feature. They can release to beta testers, to early adopters. They can test new features in specific markets. It can do a lot more. So Netflix is a great super app candidate because they are an orchestra. They involve multiple teams, many global markets, lots of iterations, and a huge customer base. Their Symphony is the app that users recognize a single user experience. All right, now that we turn Netflix into a super app, let's work with something on our own. Let's pretend, again, we want to migrate a photo sharing app from a monolith to a microfrontend super app architecture. I'm talking about, an app you can think of Google Photos or iCloud Photos, something very simple. We back up our, photos and videos, share with family and friends. We let them comment. It pretty much sounds like Instagram too. The point is, it has to be simple. In addition to these common features, we also want to create white label capability. And our goal is to make it incredibly fast. So that's our goal for today. When we think of an app as a whole, especially if it's a monolith, the most difficult thing is to decide how to slice it into features. I said that's especially difficult for companies that already have a monolith that they want to migrate. The features will become independent feature apps, entirely independent, and failing at this particular step will likely create long-lasting negative effect. We really have to be careful, or it's very likely that we will regret the transition to super apps and then curse everybody who talked us into it. I cover that particular topic to a greater detail in the webinar I did with Josh from Ionic called How to Be Successful with Micro Frontends. So feel free to take a look at that one if you want more tips on avoiding pitfalls. Now, in essence, we have two main slicing paradigms, vertical and horizontal. To keep things short for this presentation, vertical slicing is slicing per page or per view. And this probably is the oldest and the simpler slicing technique for long-term maintenance. I'll give you an example. Amazon, right? Amazon will transition you to a separate, they will transition you to a separate website when you go to checkout. It's a separate experience, and that experience is managed by a dedicated team. And that team is really allowed to do whatever they want because it's a completely separate website. It's integrated specifically, and they have kind of dedicated website, if you will, too. And that may sound like the way to go. Sounds fairly simple and easy and stress-free, but from the super apps perspective, there is a better way. And I think I just called out one of the main advantages of the other thing, and that's horizontal slicing, without explicitly saying what the advantage is. Horizontally sliced micro frontends are decoupled into features and not pages. When you watch video on YouTube, you will have the video player comments in the playlist on the side. Let's just use those three features. Each one of the features can be treated as an independent app. Maybe it is at Google. And those apps can be interacted with at the same time. They may be completely independent, but they are, at the end, they're integrated to act as a whole, as a product. Now, horizontal slicing works great with integration at runtime and is a very natural, organic selection for super apps. In the example of our photo app, we can slice features like authentication, photo viewer, photo collection, the commenting session, you know it. Those are just to name a few. It's very similar to the YouTube example, come to think of it. So we will treat each feature as an independent application, each one owned by a team. I really fancy module federation as a build and integration technology for microfrontends and super apps. Module federation is very standards-based and stable and really works well. I think the major benefit of module federation is integration at runtime, which means you get lazy loading out of the box together with a fantastic dependency management runtime based on semantic versioning. It's incredibly powerful. By the way, just a side note, semantic versioning for everything you release is going to be a very reliable friend with super apps and microfrontends in general. So don't forget to version everything semantically. All right, the main principle of integration at runtime is very, very similar to the purple pattern that you may know from Google, or PWAs, progressive web apps. It's very progressive, right? We want, actually, we start with the core and then attach features to the core. We don't really load up everything at once, of course. We'll only introduce features and components as they are requested by the user. And since we use horizontal slicing, we are likely to end up having multiple feature apps loaded at the same time. And some of these will even be nested. So in this example, the photo viewer app can embed comments and maybe even in future the shopping cart feature app as well. If you're tracking and if you can handle an attempt of me to confuse you, then hear me out. If you're kind of lingering there, lost, cover your ears for a second. I'll cover one of mine and I'll signal that you can come back. So I'll try to confuse you, all right? Feature apps inherit the core functionality. And in essence, all right, so cover your ears. In essence, feature apps become the core, and the core is nothing more than just an elevated feature app. All right, I know you can listen now. It sounds confusing, but I'll try to unpack that in the next few slides. Let's take a step back and dive into the super app core for a minute. The core, this is a big one. The core should ship with minimal code, minimal dependencies, assets, API requests. Let's just make it a minimum. I know it doesn't, this chart doesn't look very minimal. And that's exactly why I need to stress the importance of being conservative with the amount of code that we introduce. The thing about super apps, and feel free to think of WeChat as I say this, is that you never really know how things will play out. There are infinite possibilities in combinations of features that may end up integrating at the same time. It's all driven by the user, usually. Also because teams are so independent, we never really know what they will come up with. And this is one of the biggest challenges in super apps. It's why we need a small but very robust application core. It's why we need a minimal set of contractual agreements. You know, a lot of freedom and democracy, but a little bit of shared understanding is going to go great lengths here. Because we are using horizontal slicing and integration at runtime, some concessions do need to be made. For one, all features should share the same framework, and all dependencies in the app core should possibly be reusable with all the features. Now, that means if we choose, for example, the routing library, right? We choose to go with a specific routing library for a system. We don't want to introduce a new one later in features, right? That's going to create a lot of mess. This doesn't mean we remove the benefit of democracy, right? That's all the jazz for microfrontends. But we create contractual agreements for just a few important libraries. It's a small concession to make, but it can be extremely useful, extremely helpful. The next kind of a tip about core that I want to give you is that sooner or later, we will run into the situation where two features require significantly different versions of the same dependency, same library. In most cases, the built-in dependency management runtime, if you use module federation, that runtime will take care of those issues automatically. And everything's going to work just fine. But sometimes libraries depend on information that the libraries, they think is shared. So when two versions are loaded, they are in separate sandboxes, unaware of one another. That's how we can load multiple versions of the same library in the browser at the same time. But here's the catch. Memory providers, right? If your library requires some kind of centralized memory allocation, those memory providers will not know how to share state because they think they are the only instance in the app, right? I will tell you a little bit more about this in an actual example for an actual library in a minute. And here's another tip, and this is where you can benefit from creating a simple shared object. If you create a simple, very simple JavaScript shared object or map that serves as a shared memory allocation, just like global this, but not global to the browser, global to the app only, that's going to help you a great deal. Use that to share memory for the context of your app. That worked really well in the past. One other thing I want you to try to avoid is, I'm emphasizing try to avoid, is communication between features. You've probably read that if you are either working with microfriends or looking into microfriends. But that's even more important if you use horizontally sliced features. And only in rare situations, it actually becomes a necessity to communicate. So we need to ensure a decent protocol, simple, lightweight, that allows for that, but doesn't really create the burden of yet another dependency. One simple pattern is just using custom browser events, or even better, you can use routing. The simpler, the better. Speaking of routing again, in addition to just the usual site level navigation that any normal app has, feature apps may have the need for internal navigation on their own. And that may require custom tweaks to the existing routing libraries. I know it doesn't sound like a big of a deal when you hear it, but in some cases, multiple feature apps need to use internal state in the form of routing that's agnostic of any other app that's also present on the same page. Like a very simple example is if you have two feature apps that both have tabs that need to be tied into routing, that can be tricky to set up. So it usually requires a little bit of action. Then if you white label, right, the core is a great place where you're going to include all tokens, API keys, strings, theming definitions, and others. So it's really best if you can hard code that data in the build step in the core. You really want to reduce the number of requests, network requests, wherever possible for the app core. So as I said, the core is unaware of what you integrate into it. It's very agnostic, and that asks for special care, right? This reminds me of a story, you might have heard of it, from the 16th century London, when calling something black swan was a statement of impossibility, right? It's never going to happen. And then in the 17th century, Dutch explorers documented sighting of a black swan in Western Australia. And that entirely changed the metaphor to something that we think cannot happen, but it possibly will. Now, in hindsight, we'll always say that it was predictable, but in real life, it's never really predictable. So super apps are full of black swans. And that's why a strong core makes coping with surprises slightly more bearable. No fear. So here's another tip. Here's a tip that will help you avoid that black swan effect. Also something that I promised to talk about. When you decide on libraries that you want to use in your project, especially those that will be reused and may end up in the app core, try to avoid singletons at all costs. A good example is, and I have nothing against a library, I'm just using it as an example, styled components. You can have multiple instances of styled components, much less multiple instances of different versions. No. There needs to be just one, and that one keeps track of everything that's going on the page. And it needs that to better optimize for performance and styling. And the problem with singletons is that they make it really hard to upgrade, especially when backwards compatibility isn't really fully there. And to be honest, that's very often the case. In some cases, it's going to go as far as you need to upgrade all the feature apps and the core simultaneously. For highly scalable giants, this is a huge issue. They're going to have multiple versions of feature apps, dozens of features, dozens of cores, and updating everything at the same time, close to impossible, can be a big problem. So if I were someone important, I'd say CSS comes with first-class supporting browsers. So there's absolutely no need to introduce another dependency to maintain. And this is the level of thinking, right? Betting on standards is very helpful in such large systems. Now, let's take a look at feature apps for a minute. We already understand that feature app teams own their development and release as an end-to-end process. That really means that teams have the mandate to choose their own stacks. As we said, democracy. And I'd say, about 70% of that stack that they choose to use is about right. 30%, I think that's good for our contractual agreement. As you can see here, feature apps can have their own assets, their own API endpoints, dependencies, internationalization strings, access control, and a lot of other things. But they really need a little bit of overlap with the rest of the system, As an example, if every feature app team decided to use their own font and color scheme, right? Would that look good? Absolutely not. And there needs to be that shared understanding on the design system in this case. The core comes to the rescue with the basics, and then feature apps enhance the basics, right? And feature apps are enhancing the core. That's what it's all about. You'll also notice that I mentioned a micro-Frontends library on the screen. And this is an internal library where we keep common APIs, right? Not endpoints, but runtime APIs. I'm talking about shared functionalities that help us perform common operations such as dynamic loading, communicating, getting data from the environment, maybe tracking utilities, or even localization. You'll notice some backend components in this list. And you might say, oh, what is he talking about? This is a micro front end event, right? Well, in micro front ends and in super apps, team focus around business value. And micro front ends are about front ends, but business value doesn't care what's in the back end or front end. And with that said, we need to be able to see features holistically for what they are. Everything that goes into a feature is a part of a feature app. It can be front end, it can be back end, it can be infrastructure, CI, CD, testing, and usually more than that. when I said that we need to observe feature apps holistically, I meant that in the context of the value it delivers, right? If we are creating a commenting feature app, then we are going to do everything we need to make a good commenting feature. We're going to build a UI, backend services, database, you get it. But we're going to worry about deployment too. We're going to worry about recognition AI. We're going to worry about, everything that's in scope of the value proposition of that business value, right? Business value proposition. But that's where our world is, our little planet in the solar system, right? Feature. In fact, if the app was a planet, we could place it in the orbit of any star that's just like sun, given that we as a planet can receive the required heat and light. If you see what I did here, right? We control our own gravity, our own atmospheric conditions, but the star we revolve around provides with the basic context, data. And that makes feature apps anti-holistic. What that means, in other words, they don't care what the core is, what the other apps are integrated. They don't care what the name of the star system they are in. They don't really care about that, so long they have minimal requirements provided. So feature apps are entirely isolated, given that they're given the right context. They don't have to be, but that's good practice. What we covered so far is a high-level system architecture, but it's important that everybody involved is on the same page. And that doesn't mean that they have to start from scratch when they decide to start a new feature app, right? It would be incredibly useful when you create your own super app architecture to set up a template that helps teams scaffold a new project, a new feature app. There are many ways you can go about that. It really depends on the amount of templated code, auto updating internal dependencies, systems like that. And it's entirely on you to decide, but it's good to have that. All right, so far we have that basic setup for super apps. We have the core, we have feature apps, and that works really great in the browser. Now, mobile apps, though, they require something different, a slight change in the setup. So sometimes we'll need to interact with custom native APIs, for example, for single sign-on that has to go through the native code. In that, for that, we need a shell. We need a native shell for distribution to the app stores as well. Anyway, right? And you know it, that native shell is, I think, always capacitor. And if you can still embed, I'm going to say features, but not as feature apps into that native shell. It's those features as are going to serve as API endpoints, like in the example of single sign-on. It's going to be an extension of feature apps, but it has to be there at all times, right? So let me give an example. So some native apps, some native code that has to be in the container may include things like, as I said, authentication, token storage, secure storage, obviously hardware access, any other compiled codes that needs to ship with the app, right? And obviously, these can all be capacitor plugins. So there's a catch with all this. To play by the rules of the App Store, we cannot load features on demand. That's to say that all the features have to be bundled together in the app. A browser can still integrate at runtime from the cloud, but native apps need to integrate everything in the package. It has to be integrated at build time. You can, however, push minor updates to the existing features, and that's still incredible because you don't have to wait for the approval to push hotfixes. Now, this all sounds like a lot of work, and honestly, it is. I've been there without portals and with portals, and I think it's really helpful to use something like Ionic portals. It helps avoid a lot of headache, so you don't have to do that on your own and maintain that process. All right, so let me also tell you a small real life story. Audi. Audi is present in about 190 or so markets. They have hundreds of websites that are created from a pool of feature apps that have a life on their own, right? For example, some websites integrate car configurator, and sometimes it's version 1 or sometimes it's version 2. Now, versions are very hypothetical in this example, of course. So every market is allowed a different lists of features as well. Now, the cool thing is that assembling websites for Audi is not what engineers do. It's what content managers do, right? They get to place features in the app and configure them as needed. No engineers required. And for that purpose, you can use headless content managers like a CMS. A CMS creates a dynamic configuration, really, that tells the app, starting from the core, which features to load in a given place or route or page. When we have that between the core and feature apps, and then among feature apps, we finally achieve that ability to update the app on the fly, right? To update it on the fly, so long it's, especially if it's delivered in browsers. So as soon as we make those changes, they get to be deployed by the means of an updated configuration set, right? As content managers change things, they get applied immediately. Something I really, really like about this setup is that content authors can easily preview what the app will look like after a change without ever having to rebuild and publish beta versions, propagate, distribute, all that goes away. This also gives them that ability to have multiple versions of configuration with that CMS. So they essentially perform tasks like A/B testing, pre-releases for early adopters, and a lot more. Now, the CMS can be improved with something that I like to call the feature registry. And feature registry is a centralized place that knows about all the features and versions available for content authors to use. Versions are particularly useful if they are semantically correct. With this system, you can easily auto-upgrade features, so users always get the latest version, right? You can also get this. You can also auto-flag buggy features so that the registry decides to flag them out, remove them from the distribution, and load the last known good version instead. That's how amazing the micro-front-end super app architecture is, especially if you have something like a feature registry. With the registry and the CMS in place, now we have something I like to call a fully working delivery triangle. The core asks the CMS what it should load, and then the CMS points to the registry. So you don't really request anything from an S3 bucket or something directly. You do something that's far more versatile by involving the registry. A lot of this can be done by simply using Ionic portals, right? So you don't have to worry about creating a registry. That's again a lot of work that you don't have to care about, which is especially useful for smaller teams. Again, having something like this incredibly valuable. And then the last piece, and this last piece is basically relevant if you're creating a white label product, particularly then, of course, it would make sense to have something with an UI where you can create new tenants. I don't mean you, but probably people who are usually not that technical, and they want to create a new tenant for the product. Set up a new tenant, provision all the data that's required for tenants. In the super app world, that means that a fixed part of the config is going to be distributed. It's going to come from the tenant manager. It's going to be distributed into the app core. This is what it looks like, right? This is the for this presentation, this is the final diagram. And as you can see in it, the tenant manager would really create a new instance of the super app core, right? That's what it means to involve white labeling in super apps. So a new instance of super app core for each new tenant, and potentially, if you can, hard code most of that tenant data into the core, so that it loads fast, and that data is going to create context for the feature apps to use, like the sun. Multi-tenancy gets to be slightly less complex in a microfinance architecture than monoliths, because your product is already fragmented. So all the tweaks and custom versions that your customers require can really be composable and load on top of the existing system. And that's it. This is our overall super app architecture all in one place. With this, we can say that the MVP for the Photos app is ready, right? The one cool thing that I love to kind of bring up to product managers is that at this point, they can start developing new features, and they can introduce them to the users and to the app without having to rebuild the core. They can just plug and play. And trust me, product managers, they absolutely love this capability. And from there onwards, their life and the cycle, the release cycle is going to be a lot more efficient. It's going to be changed forever. So as you embark on the journey of creating a super app architecture, make sure you pay attention to development experience. I already gave a couple of tips in this presentation, and I firmly believe that every investment in that area will pay off. One of the interesting metrics you can use to estimate if your dev experience is good is onboarding time. The more time the new team members need to spend to start being productive, the less efficient they will be. So ideally, they should be able to bring their knowledge and their experience to the team and start contributing right away. For that, you don't really want them to spend weeks reading documentation. You don't want them to spend time learning new proprietary APIs or ways of doing things that are very special for this app. None of that is good. They should use the pre-learned skills, and think of that. Those are actually standards. The pre-learned skill is the knowledge in the world. Coming with that into your organization should be enough for new team members to be productive. It's also a good idea to create a CLI. So that's a really good idea. And I absolutely love what AHA is doing with their CLI. The CLI allows developers to debug apps on the actual production site in real time. You basically don't need anything locally other than Node.js just to start the development bridge. Now, imagine how powerful it is to be able to test your feature that's already integrated in production site, obviously just for your eyes, and with the production data in that mix too. And that is absolutely mind-blowing to develop and see that in real time in production. Amazing. All right, let's wrap it up. I know there was a lot today, and I know you can always get back to this video later. The thought that I think stood out, or that I want, the thought I want to be standing out from this talk, is that super apps are much more an organizational pattern than a technical solution, just like micro frontends. Don't follow any shiny objects like new frameworks that will sprinkle some voodoo magic all over your product. This is not the place for that. However, super apps architecture can easily become it can become a complex system if we try to experiment with things, and it's one of the most comprehensive microfrontends patterns. So do yourself a favor and keep things simple wherever possible. One of the best ways to ensure that simplicity is sticking with the standards. Now, this architecture rarely tolerates fooling around with bleeding edge technologies. So standards are golden. All right, I know that there are things that you want to learn more about or clarify. So it's time for me to kind of land the plane and catch up with your questions. You can also take note of my email here, use it. If you think of something that you want to talk about offline, feel free to take that.